books to be donated to the Worldwide Book Drive, a nonprofit organization dedicated to literacy. It's donating more than 3 million books globally. They're not all coming from Snow College, and they're used to help educate some of the world's neediest citizens. So if you have old books, be sure to bring them back with you after spring break. And there'll be boxes in the GSC, the LDS Institute, the Humanities Building, where you can drop these books off. Enjoy your spring break, and please bring back some old books for the Worldwide Book Drive. Thank you. Also, another announcement, which is take out your cell phones, please, and turn them off. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Pat Bagley was born in Salt Lake and raised in Oceanside, California, near San Diego, where his father was mayor and his mother was a school teacher. Always interested in politics, during high school, Bagley participated in a public broadcast system interview with Ronald Reagan. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he was a proselyting missionary in the Bolivia La Paz mission from 75 to 77. In 78, he received his degree in political science and history with a history minor from BYU, and Bagley has 2 sons now, Miles and Alec. Will Bagley, his older brother, has come here. He came 2 years ago to Convocation to talk about his book, This Is the Place, A Crossroads of Utah Past, that he did with Pat. Pat is also an illustrator and author of independent political cartoons, and he's the, of course, chief cartoonist for the Salt Lake Tribune, editorial cartoonist. And he's also done many children's books. His liberal political stance contrasts with the conservative state of Utah and has influenced several books of political cartoons and humor, including, I love these titles, Ways to Survive 4 More Years with George W. Bush, Clueless George Goes to War, Clueless George is Watching You, and Clueless George Takes on Liberals. Bagley describes himself as a moderate Republican who became a liberal independent during the presidency of George Bush. He often addresses the predominant Utah culture of conservative politics and the LDS Church in his cartoons. His joking about Jell-O consumption in Utah has helped motivate the Utah State Senate to declare it an official 2001 legislative resolution that Jell-O is, quote, the favorite snack food of Utah. Some of you have seen his Olympic pins that he designed and were used during the 2002 Winter Olympics, pins including 7 brides for 1 brother, in memory, of course, of Utah and polygamy. Crickets make me barf, a seagull pin. Also, I would like to say that Mr. Bagley has, by himself, done 12 books, but he and I were arguing. I think he's up to over 40 books for books that he's also illustrated as well as responsible for solely. Some of these books you know. He's the one who wrote I Spy a Nephite, Norman the Nephite and the Amazing Conference Center, Dinosaurs of Utah, and Dinosaur Destinations. Some of you know some of his works. And I would like to now turn the time over to political cartoonist from the Salt Lake Tribune, Mr. Pat Bagley.
Thanks for coming. I want to say happy vernal equinox. And if you don't know what that is, I'll tell you. You're all familiar with Stonehenge in England, you know, the big megaliths that were put up in pillars. And it was arranged to keep track of the passage of the sun and the moon. Okay, well actually, Utah towns are kind of built the same way. You know, the streets go north and south and east and west. So tonight when the sun sets, if you look directly west, that way, I think, if you look directly west down the street, straight as an arrow, the sun is going to be setting right at the end of the street. And that only happens a couple times a year. So happy vernal equinox. I want to thank Steve for the great introduction. Let's see if this all works. Oh, there we go. Okay, Steve mentioned that I do political cartoons. And actually, I think that Mitt Romney, when he ran for president, he should have made me his campaign coordinator. You know, don't you think so? Choose the Romney. Great campaign slogan. Well, I got doing cartoons back at BYU, and it's been quite a while ago. But it's an interesting story, if I do say so myself. I was going to school like you, and I was taking classes, and some of the classes were more boring than others. And in those boring classes, I would tend to kind of drift, and I would start to sketch in my class notes. And there was one class I was taking, it was personal finance. And right in the middle of the class notes, all of a sudden I get this idea for a cartoon. So I sketch out this right in the middle of the class notes, this cartoon that just kind of explodes. And I look at the cartoon and I think, that's not a bad idea. And it had to do with a topic that was then current at BYU, because BYU was being sued by the government because they didn't allow men and women to live in the same apartment building. Even if you were a student going to BYU, you had to live in approved housing by the university, even if it was off campus. So, I did this cartoon and I thought, I'm going to take this to the Daily Universe and I'll give them the idea, and they'll have their cartoonist, Steve Benson, do a final copy. And Steve Benson, little local connection here, is the brother of Mike Benson, who was the president at the university here until just recently, I guess. What they did is they sent me home to do a final copy of the cartoon, so I did the cartoon, took it back to the paper. The next day they ran it in the paper. And seeing your stuff in the newspaper, it's quite a rush. And I was very excited about this. And they asked me to stay on to do cartoons over the summer. And so that's how I first got started doing this. But the upshot is that I was a couple weeks after this cartoon ran in the paper. I went to my job at a graphics firm on campus, and the secretary said, by the way, congratulations on getting your cartoon into Time magazine. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, well, it was your cartoon in Time magazine. And so I described the cartoon, and she said, yeah, that's it. It was in Time magazine. So I ran out, and I picked up Time magazine, and sure enough, the very first cartoon I ever had published made it into Time magazine. And it's been downhill ever since. But once that happened, I was hooked, and I had to be a cartoonist. So I went from BYU up to Salt Lake and started working at the Salt Lake Tribune. Something I wanted to say here. This is today's cartoon. If you can read that. Price recently paid for a rare breed of dog meant to enhance the status of the wealthy owner. $2 million. This is true. A dog sold for $2 million in China. Okay, now next to it, value of the mutt your family fell in love with at the local animal shelter. It's priceless. Those of you who have a dog, the dog becomes a part of the family. Okay, and I show you this because what you do as a cartoonist is you bring to your craft what you understand, what you know. And this is something that we can all relate to, right? We all love our animals, we all love our pets. And you see the dog on the far right, the cute little puppy? Okay, there he is today. That's Balto. Okay, and this is that cartoon that I did back for the Daily Universe. You see this woman with a suitcase, and she's at some guy's apartment, and the guy is saying, hey guys, our new roommate is here. And you don't know who the woman is, but she was a feminist figure back from the 70s whose name was Bella Abzug. And that was the cartoon that got published in Time magazine. Now, when it came out in the Daily Universe at BYU, we got a lot of letters to the editor that complained about this cartoon. And they didn't necessarily complain about what it was saying. They complained about the Farrah Fawcett poster on the wall. Okay, this next cartoon isn't mine. Okay, it says, if anyone asks, you hit him in the forehead. So when you get your news, you depend on reporters, just like I do. And I'm showing this to you because if it had been a Salt Lake Tribune reporter, you would have gotten the straight story. This guy's obviously from the Deseret News. Same day, we have two papers in Salt Lake City. The headline on the Salt Lake Tribune says, "Quake kills millions in California." Same day, Deseret News, General Conference opens. So two newspapers with kind of a different slant on things. This cartoon, the newspaper industry's hit hard times, but there was a time back not that long ago where the newspaper was physically bigger. You know, it was this big, and then you'd open it up and it'd be that big. And there would be sections, full sections of classified ads. And today, the newspaper is about that wide, and we don't have, well, we have half a page of classified ads because you can go to Craigslist or to KSL.com, and that's where all of our advertising has gone. And the reason that newspapers are doing poorly these days is not because they're liberal or conservative, it's because the advertising has just kind of dried up. And people are going to the internet now for their news. These are cartoons about Utah from, 120, 130 years ago. And this is how they depicted Utah, and this is how they thought of Mormons. You see this skull, and you see all these women, and there's a missionary in there somewhere who's obviously enticed these young women to come to Utah where they're going to be inducted into polygamy. But if you were growing up outside of Utah, this is the image that you had. You know, it was just a horrible place. And cartoonists back then were incredibly racist, and they didn't, well, we wouldn't do this today because it's not right. But if you look on the lower left down here, this guy has got a little thing that says polygamy. So that's a Mormon. And in the bed, you see Uncle Sam is kicking out all the undesirables. So among all the undesirables, he's also kicking out Mormons. And on the far right, you know, we just had St. Patrick's Day. That's an Irishman. This is the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. And on the left is an alligator, and he's labeled Roman Church, which is another name for the Catholic Church. Now, if you kind of look at it sideways, you can see that the mouth of the alligator is the mitre, is the Pope's mitre cap with teeth. You can kind of see the face facing down towards the dome. Can you see that? And on the right, the Mormon Church is depicted as the tabernacle. Now, this was done by Thomas Nast, who was probably the most famous political cartoonist in America. And he's the guy who invented the Republican elephant and the Democratic donkey. And the image that we have of Santa Claus these days was pretty much set in stone by Thomas Nast. But he did this cartoon, and on the Capitol Dome it says, "Religious liberty is guaranteed, but can we allow foreign reptiles to crawl all over U.S., all over us?" It wasn't that long ago that Mormons were perceived as being outside the mainstream. You know, we go from from Mitt Romney, Governor Romney, running as the Republican nominee, but there was a time where Mormons were in bad favor. Okay, I'm going to show you some cartoons, kind of my take on Utah. Here's the welcome sign when you come into the state. "Welcome to Utah, a wholly owned and operated subsidiary of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Now, doing cartoons in Utah is a lot of fun because there are so many sacred cows. There are whole herds of sacred cows in Utah. And I make a distinction between what I can do and what I cannot make fun of, you know. And the trouble is, a lot of people think that things like green jello are sacred. You know, I don't mess with the sacred, but there are people who culturally think that anything I have to do with the cultural side of Mormonism is kind of beyond the pale. But I kind of like to see how far I can go. I did a cartoon once that, and this is what I want to achieve with the cartoon. I did this cartoon and I showed it to my neighbor who sings for the Tabernacle Choir. And his first reaction was to laugh, you know, "Ha!" And then he kind of goes, I'm not sure I should have laughed at that. But that's what I want to do. So these first cartoons are going to show you some of the cultural aspects of Utah. Okay, this is the Provo Temple. It says, pull up Zerblot. It's not the imperial mothership. Okay, and we have these two temples that are kind of different looking. One is in Ogden and then this one in Provo. And a true story, there's a water tower just down the street from the Provo Temple, a water tank. And when they built the temple, the city council got together and debated whether they should dress up the water tower to make it look like the temple. And they didn't do it. Recently, the church has announced, and I think I got this right, that they're going to be remodeling, demolishing, and rebuilding the Provo Temple. So it's this mothership UFO thing is not going to be there much longer. Okay, this is the church office building. Brother Henderson, thinking outside the box again, are we? The suit's a little bit too light, the tie is a little bit too wild. This is the other side of the same coin, though. You Mormons are so bizarre. Well, it depends on how you look at it. This is the Mormon remake of the Hitchcock classic, The Birds. There are a lot of images that I can draw on as I do my cartoons. And, for example, we have the seagulls and the crickets, and the idea of our ancestors who came across the plains and suffered, tremendously. And I don't think we really appreciate just how much they suffered coming across the plains. The hardship suffered by our pioneer ancestors can't be overestimated. There weren't a whole lot of McDonald's playlands along the way. This is another old cartoon, kind of hard to see, but this is the Otto Mormon, expressly designed for family use in Utah. So there you see the husband in the driver's seat, and then all of his wives, and I'm sure there's another bus and back for the kids. Again, this is kind of the image they had of us, back 100 years ago, not that long ago. And I actually did this cartoon before I knew that this cartoon existed. This is my take. On the left is what people think they see when they come to Utah. They think that we're Mennonites with a lot of wives. But on the right is what they actually see. This next cartoon, I had to give it a lot of thought. Because as far as I knew, no living president of the church had ever been cartooned in the Salt Lake Tribune. And this goes long before the whole cartooning the prophet controversy with the Muslims. There were the Danish cartoonists who cartooned Muhammad, right? And apparently cartooning the prophet got them in a lot of trouble. Well, even before all that happened, I had to wrestle with the same question. Can I draw a cartoon of the prophet and get away with it? But Gordon B. Hinckley had just become president of the church, and he was very different from other presidents of the church in that he invited the media to come and talk to him. He went on 60 Minutes. He became good friends with Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. He was on Larry King. He was talking to the press. He was very open to the Salt Lake Tribune. And so I'm thinking, well, if he's out there in the public, then he's fair game. So I did this cartoon. This is Larry King live. And Larry King is saying, when we return, more of Mormons, ordinary people just trying to become gods. So this cartoon came out, and I found out that there are any number of people who are willing to be offended on Gordon B. Hinckley's behalf. And they all wrote to me, and they called me, and they said that this is sacrilegious, doing a cartoon like that. But I heard through back channels that people had shown Gordon B. Hinckley the cartoon, and he kind of liked it. He was okay with it. And actually, he looks kind of cute there, don't you think? Here we have the Museum of Natural History. There's the Allosaurus, there's the dodo, there's the mammoth, and in the middle is a Democrat under glass. We had the last one stuffed. This is an issue that, I mean, this is an old cartoon. I think I did this back in the 80s. But it's still an issue of, you know, do you preserve the land for recreation and for our children, or do you develop it? And it's a constant tug of war. And I imagine when I'm dead and gone, it's still going to be going on in Utah. Well, this is a cartoon that I did, again, quite a while ago. The background of this is that there was an exhibit of Rodin. He's a very famous French sculptor, and you're familiar with some of his work, even if you don't recognize the name. And he did The Thinker, you know, you recognize that. He also did a statue that's called The Kiss, of two people kissing. And they're unclothed, but as you can tell, it's kind of hard to, you know, really see anything. But BYU didn't feel comfortable exhibiting some of the statues that were naked. And so they put those back in a place where nobody had access to them, and they only put out the statues that they felt were appropriate. And of course, this blew up and became big news all over the world, and this was my take on it. And the BYU administrator is saying, okay, this one can stay, but I want the offending portion covered. A little background on the next cartoon. There was a cricket infestation in the western United States, and it took up a lot of Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And about this time I was driving the kids, and we pulled over to go see Cove Fort. We got off the freeway, and it looked like the road was moving because there were so many crickets on the road. It was just amazing. And I heard that later they had to get out the snowplows to kind of scrape off all these little cricket corpses from the road because it just got too slick. But, you know, I realized then that the stories of the crickets and the gulls were, you know, they weren't exaggerated. This is something very real. So anyway, we had this infestation back a few years ago, and this guy on the left is reading about it. Crickets invade western U.S., and he says, how do you know they're Mormon crickets? Well, they're polite, clean cut. I had cousins who, this is going back a ways, you know, this is going back quite a while, that they would go out and dig up stuff. You know, they go to archaeological sites, or they go to southern Utah and dig up stuff, pots and stuff like that, which we know now is inappropriate. But back then, that's just what people did. And we had an issue a couple of years ago where people back in southern Utah were digging up stuff and selling it, and they were doing it on government land, and they weren't supposed to be doing it. And that's what prompted this cartoon. But there's tons of cool stuff just lying in there. Okay, so when you think of your own ancestors being dug up and, you know, the bodies robbed, then it becomes a little closer to home. This is a cartoon about John Swallow, who was our Attorney General, that pretty much turned the Attorney General's office into a protection racket. He was selling influence. And so I brought this because I think you could, you know, appreciate it. Gee, I wish I could give you my emails, but the dog ate them. And then it ate my e-calendar and my state desktop computer, and it ate my state laptop computer, and it ate my state handheld device and my home computer and my cell phone. Bad dog. So he had 7 different electronic devices where the emails, all of the information that was relevant to the investigation had disappeared. Looks awfully suspicious to me. That's kind of a complicated, long cartoon. This is a little more simple. This is the Swallow probe, Utah GOP. You know, not the Utah GOP's finest hour. When you look at cartoons, it's kind of fun to look at the details. You know, like, for instance, look at the mammoth's toes. Okay, we recently just ended the legislative session, and this is the cartoon I did just at the beginning of it. And these people are looking out, they're in the church office building, and they're saying, do other religions have their very own legislatures? Okay, and that kind of hazy stuff out there, we get the inversion in Salt Lake City. The next cartoon is probably one of my finest. And again, this is an old cartoon, but there's this struggle between church and state in Utah. You know, there's no question that the LDS Church has tremendous influence in the affairs of politics here. And this is an illustration of how things work. You know, again, the scene inside the church office building. Sister Finchley, I'm tired of these stories in the media that say the church calls all the shots in Utah. Have the legislature pass a resolution denying it. Uh-oh, that's not good. Well, true story. Well, true story about that last cartoon that you saw. The state commissioned this guy to do a review of the state liquor laws, and he spent the whole year updating the laws and making them more rational. But anything having to do with liquor in Utah is just radioactive. So the commission did its work, they made all these recommendations, but to finally turn it into law, they had to get a state senator, just one, to sponsor it as a bill. So all the recommendations that this guy had worked on so hard, he could not find one state senator who would put his name to it. Well, he'd done all this work, so he went down to the church office building, and he talked to the public relations department there and the public affairs people. And they looked at it, and they looked at all the recommendations, and they said, well, this is reasonable. We've got no problem with this. And word got back up to the state capitol, and every single state senator ended up putting his name as a sponsor of that bill. That's kind of profiles in courage for Utah. Is that it? Okay, well, this may be it as far as I was most of the way through anyway. So I get asked quite a bit, what is the cartoon that's gotten the most reaction? And I've been doing this for almost 35 years, and there have been a lot, but the one that got the most reaction was one I did about state workers, state employees, and the cartoon was this guy's in this cubicle, he's a state worker, and he's on the telephone saying, well, I'm not sure I can fit another holiday into my busy schedule. And you see his calendar in the back, and he's got holiday, vacation time, comp time, holiday, and he can't fit it in because he's got all these days off already, right? So I did the cartoon, and then he came back the next day to work when it was published, and we had 5 different lines coming into the Tribune, 5 different phone lines, and all of them were lit up, and all of them were angry about that cartoon. And so I took calls from these people from 8 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock, and then mysteriously the calls all stopped. Then they started again at 1 o'clock, and went to 5 o'clock, and then again they all stopped. Kind of making my point. So it looks like we had a little technical failure here. So let me talk about some of these that I was going to show you. There was a cartoon of a couple of state legislators that are walking up the state capitol steps, and one is saying to the other, we had it there for a minute. Well, one legislator is saying to the other, he says, remember when the word gay meant happy, fun-loving, lighthearted? And then the next frame, he says, I hated it back then too. Okay, we up? Looks like it. Okay, cool. There it is. Remember when the word gay meant happy, fun-loving, lighthearted? I hated it back then too. Okay, this is again an old cartoon, and I used to have to draw these guys, and I would have to write the legislature, on them, and that's kind of hard to fit. It's a big word to fit. But I've recently started to draw, not recently, over the past, 20 years, I've drawn Utah legislators that look like this. And people are so familiar with this character now that they know when they draw it, this is a Utah legislator. So during this last legislative session, I did this series of cartoons for Valentine's Day. Those candy hearts that you get with the message. These are legislative candy hearts. There's Hot Lips. There's Be My Compound Constitutional Republic. And the story behind that is they passed this law a couple of years ago where they said, we're not a democracy, we're not a republic, we're a compound constitutional republic, whatever that means. It meant something to them anyway. Love you, but not in a gay way. The Behave State. Tread on Me. My Heart is Concealed Carry. Okay, again, you can see how these guys fit into my cartoons. I don't have to write legislature on them. But this is the Utah Legislature Ignorance Swap Meet. This is where they all get together and they swap stories that are not true, but they believe are true. And he's saying, I'll trade you this bag of precious CO2 gas I got from Rush Limbaugh for that sack of gems you picked up from following Glenn Beck. Okay, and the story behind the CO2 gas is that there was a legislator on a committee who said, CO2 gas is not a problem. It's fine for the dinosaurs. We should have more CO2 gas, which is just absolutely, it's just way out there, right? So that's where you got that idea. And if you know anything about the time of the dinosaurs, you know that there was no ice at either pole. There were dinosaurs living in Antarctica, very different world. So if you want Sanpete Valley to be a huge sand dune, then go ahead and pump up the CO2. Oh, you're all familiar with this, the goblin toppler. They were recently sentenced. Rock, paper, seizure. The rest of the world is just appalled that anybody would do something like that. But, this image of, these guys pushing over the rock is something that I can use over and over again, and I'm sure that I will. But I used it recently to illustrate the legislature not taking the Medicaid money to expand the Medicaid program in the state, which is kind of weird because we're paying for it already. But there they've tipped over the Medicaid expansion onto the poor, and they're saying, we were afraid it was going to hurt somebody. And this is how the legislature began this year. There's Becky Lockhart, who's the Speaker of the House, and in her opening remarks, she called Governor Herbert an inaction figure and really took him to task for lots of stuff because she is planning to run for governor, right? And so there you see, kind of cutting him up to pieces and throwing him out to the right-wing red meat crowd. But by the end of the legislature, her plan had gone awry. She came out with this $300 million education plan that would have given iPads to every student. And it was kind of a half-baked idea because giving students iPads is only half of it. You've got to train the teachers, you've got to have curriculum, you've got to make sure that it's used correctly. And so here we have Becky Lockhart, Becky.gov. She's got her Education Technology Initiative, a half-baked something that makes it sound like you're not doing nothing about education when you run for governor in 2016. Quantity, one, list price, $300 million. But there you see Governor Herbert getting his revenge. He's going to press the delete, or in this case, the veto button. Okay, you're going to have to stretch yourselves here. It may be offensive to somebody, but I expect at least 10% of people to be offended by my cartoons. It's kind of my version of tithing. Okay, imagine that your Dallin Oaks once said something, this is a couple years ago, that was, he later kind of backed down from it, but it was critical of gays. Okay, and this is the cartoon I did. Imagine that you're Dallin Oaks and you wake up one morning to find being LDS can get you fired, or your LDS marriage is invalid, or that Mormons are banned from the armed forces, or Mormons are marginalized as deviants and sexual predators. Mormonism is scapegoated for everything wrong in America. Okay, now you know what it's like to wake up gay every day in America. Okay, this list of things that I put down the left side, there was a time where Mormons were excluded from the mainstream of American life, and all those things are true. You know, so this is one of those things where you see things from another person's point of view, and it might just change your outlook. This is a cartoon I did. I wanted to bring this because my editor almost didn't let me do this. And there you see they're going to burn a gay at the stake, and the guy is justifying it by saying, because this is my constitutionally protected religious belief. And then you see the guy on the right making this kind of, you know, dumb joke about faggot. And faggot used to mean a bundle of sticks, a bundle of wood. He was hesitant to let me do this because he says, you know, religious people don't really want to burn gays at the stake. You know, this is just going too far. And I said, well, it's a cartoon. I'm just making a point. And he finally let me do it. Well, 6 days later in Uganda, a bunch of Christians caught a guy who was gay and burned him. You know, so I was a little too close to home there, I guess. I can do nice cartoons too. Oh, and I'm sorry for the quality of this, but this is Malala, the girl who was shot by the Taliban for teaching women, promoting women education in Pakistan. She was shot in the head and she later recovered. But what terrifies religious extremists like the Taliban are not American tanks or bombs or bullets. It's a girl with a book. This is the state of the Republican Party, and I depicted the Tea Party as an adolescent mammoth. And he's saying, you are both such phonies. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And he's talking to the establishment wing of the party and to the moral majority wing of the party. And there we go again. Anyway, the establishment wing is saying, he gets it from your side of the family. Okay, we're all kind of wondering about what happened to that airplane, right? Was it human error, mechanical failure, terrorism? It's Obama's fault. The Ukraine and Crimea is kind of big in the news too. The looming threat that Russia poses to our European allies. And there's Putin who likes to go around without a shirt saying, I have gas. Because apparently about a third of the natural gas that Europe gets, they get from Putin. So this is kind of him making that I have gas threat. It's kind of a double entendre. Okay, the next one, shield your eyes if you want to see this, but it's Putin kind of naked. Okay, there he is on a bearskin rug, and the bearskin is obviously Russia, and he's covering himself with this little bit of Ukraine. Okay? A lot of people think that, you know, this just shows that he's a very decisive leader and he's strong and we're weak, but actually he's made a huge mistake. You know, you know, I'm old enough to remember back when there was a USSR and there was the Iron Curtain, but in the time since, you know, all these states that used to be part of the Soviet sphere of influence, like East Germany, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Romania, Bulgaria, they used to be under the influence of the Soviets. They've all become members of the European Union, and they've all kind of accepted American-style democracy. And this is happening in the Ukraine, which kind of freaked out Putin, because he's afraid of the same thing happening in Russia. All right, and here's the last cartoon. Remember when I started this whole thing? It was showing you that big sign, you know, welcome to Utah. This is what you see when you leave Utah. Welcome to Idaho, home of the Utah State Lottery. Okay, anyway, I think we've got some time. Do we have time for questions? Okay. So if you got a question, shout it out, and I can answer it. Okay, right there. Okay, the question is, what am I using to draw the cartoons? Most of the cartoons I used to use this felt tip pen, and I loved the felt tip pen that I used. So I would draw it, and then I would put it on the computer, scan it, and there's a program where I can shade it and color it and things like that. They stopped making that pen that I loved so much, and I was panicked, but I went back to pencil, and I've discovered that I just love pencil, you know, going old school. So it doesn't have to be high tech, it doesn't have to be expensive. I used to use very expensive paper that did, you know, wild stuff until I realized I liked typewriter paper the best. You know, I like the copy paper that's cheap. You know, it works for me. Another question? That's right. Okay, so the question is, the Salt Lake Tribune, is it generally liberal? Well, you got to go back to the beginnings of the Salt Lake Tribune, back in the 1870s and 80s, and it was established by these Mormon intellectuals who thought that Brigham Young was controlling too much of the state. And they eventually got excommunicated, but since that time, the Salt Lake Tribune has been the counterweight to the church, because the church is the 800-pound gorilla in the state of Utah. And it does need a counterweight. It does have to be the other side of the story. And over the years, you know, politically it's been kind of center, a little bit right of center. If you're a reporter, it doesn't matter. You know, you're just going out for the facts. It doesn't matter if you're left or right. You just want to get the facts right. But the editorial page is where we have our opinions. And lately, it's been a little bit left of center, I guess, which is, you know, not reflective of the whole state of Utah, but people who take the Salt Lake Tribune take it for that stance. They take it because they know where we're coming from. Okay, so the question is, how long does it take for me to do a cartoon, and you people don't appreciate them enough? Well, every day I wake up and I'm just grateful that I get to do what I do. I love my job. And every day it's a high wire act because I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes I wake up and I'm in the shower and I'll get the idea right away. And I'll go, that's great. I just have to go draw it. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll look at the newspaper, I'll listen to the radio, I'll search the news for something that really inspires me, and I come up with nothing. You know, and it's getting close to deadline and I still got nothing. And then at the last minute, I'll get the idea. So every day it's different, you know, and even drawing. Some days the drawing flows, and other days it's like I can't draw anything. And it's like any other job, is you got good days and bad days. Well, here's what you need to do is find something that you like to do. And I'm lucky that I found what I like to do. So, any other questions? Well, I grew up on the usual, you know, Peanuts. BC was a cartoon strip that I really liked. My earliest recollection of cartoons, editorial cartoons, political cartoons, the ones that really struck me, there was Pat Oliphant. And Pat Oliphant is a genius. He's just an absolute genius. Before he came to America, cartoons used to be in a vertical format, kind of like this. And they were pretty heavy-handed, where they'd show a hammer hitting a nail, and the hammer would be the Soviet Union, and the nail would be Hungary. Or the hammer would be trade unions, and the nail would be profits, you know, just dumb stuff. Well, Pat Oliphant came to America from Australia, and he brought a very different sensibility where the cartoons were horizontal mostly, and they tended to tell a story, and they were funny. They were just hilarious. And he's the guy that has that character in the corner that says a little something, you know, after the main cartoon. The character's name is Punk. But he changed it entirely. All of a sudden, everybody was imitating Oliphant, and you look at cartoons today, and they are all influenced by Pat Oliphant. Another question? So the question is, do people always disagree with my work? I think it's hard to find anybody disagreeing with. Hold on. Okay, this one. Okay, you might find a couple people that disagree with it, but not many. But that Putin cartoon that I just pulled up, you know, there would be a lot of people who would take issue with that. And there's the comment section on the website where I generally get 200-300 comments every cartoon out there. And these people fight out, you know, whether it's a good cartoon or not, back and forth. So pretty much every cartoon causes controversy. This one didn't cause any controversy because, you know, who cannot like dogs? This is just the truth. But generally, your question is, do I get people disagreeing all the time, constantly? Okay, thank you very much for coming.